room.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Elliot Gerson of the Aspen Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to the first of the 2016 McCloskey Speaker Series here at the Institute. I want to thank Bonnie McCloskey and Tom and their wonderful family for this very important public speaker series that we have. I'd also like to welcome all the listeners on Aspen Public Radio. So we're coming off a fabulous Aspen Ideas Festival. We have a very full summer ahead of all kinds of policy programs and seminars, but very importantly, we have many events like this which are for our friends and the public on critical issues. And so that's an extraordinarily important part of the range of activities of the Institute. Our guest tonight, Joel Kotkin, is a world-renowned urbanist, futurist. David Brooks calls him America's Uber geographer. He's written many highly influential books, articles, and blogs about cities, about trends in society, culture, politics, and economics. He's a presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University, and he's the director of the Center for Opportunity Urbanism in Houston. His new book, which you've seen outside, and for those of you interested, will be available. He'll sign it afterwards in the lobby. The Human City was just published this spring and is receiving enormous attention. Let me say, just by way of introduction, how much I enjoyed reading this book, especially for revealing to me how much I have been influenced by what I would call, and I think you would agree, is the conventional wisdom about urban thinking. And frankly, how much I perhaps need to question all of the prevalent assumptions that I think I've had, and my guess is many in the audience have had as well. The book is a gentle but still passionate critique of the leading school of urban planning, really not just nationally but globally, planning that favors high density, pack and stack strategies, small square footage housing units, and disfavors decentralized, more suburban kinds of living. The dominant strategies, Joel argues in the book, do attract many of the single, the young, the childless, and the rich, but frankly argues that these trends are not advantageous to most people. And he argues very strongly that while these dominant and widely accepted strategies are appealing to young and usually childless people and rich people, that most middle-class people globally, not just the United States, actually reject them. And not just because they can't afford these new hyper-expensive core urban centers, but frankly because they prefer to live in other places. He cites surveys showing that 80% of Americans, and I think similar numbers in other countries, actually prefer more village-scale settings. But the book at the same time isn't, I think, anti-urban. He advocates many choices for people, choices for different times in one's life. But he does say very clearly that unchecked, future cities could easily be like late 19th century and early 20th century environments that accentuate class divisions, decrease the quality of life for families, and even discourage families from having children. So let's actually get started by just talking about the subtitle of your book, which makes his critique pretty obvious. The subtitle is Urbanism for the Rest of Us. So let me ask you, what is urbanism for the few that you are rejecting?
Well, I think there's a urban theory which you run into all the time, which is people want to live in dense places, and they don't need a lot of space. They want to interact on a sort of daily basis with the city itself, maybe less with their neighbors. And I think that it's a very appealing vision for a certain group of people, and really two groups in particular. One, young people before they actually grow up and have kids. Now, one thing that's probably helped cities is that adolescents stay adolescent into the 30s sometimes, and and therefore what would have happened in their 20s is going to happen a little bit later. And obviously also for the very, very wealthy who have a pass out of the city anytime they want it. They can afford a big enough apartment so they're not living in very cramped spaces. And, if you live in a high-rise in Manhattan and you get to spend your summers in Aspen, that's not a bad deal. Or Newport Beach, or I can name 20 or 30 other places where they would do it. And so I think that it's that particular group that does very, very well with things. The problem is most people don't have that kind of wealth if they live in the city. So one of the things, I've done hundreds of interviews here in the United States, in Singapore, in Great Britain. For most people, there comes that point when they're in their early 30s and they say, I'm making a decent living, but if I ever want to have a family, I'm going to have to get out of central London. I can't live in the core of Paris. I'm not going to be able to live in most of New York City and Brownstone, Brooklyn, which is where my family's from, Brooklyn. They're going to have to make that choice, and that's an unfortunate choice. But to show that I wasn't that far ahead of my time, one of the great writers who inspired a lot of the thinking was H.G. Wells, and Wells, who was just an amazing genius when you think about it. He said, we're going to have two geographies in the future. One which is going to be for the family, and one is going to be for people who don't have children, and people who will ascend to a what he called a glorious extinction.
So, Joel, do you think it's a coincidence that many of the urban theorists of the school you're critiquing live in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, and London?
I think that correlates with where the media message is and where the media culture is. I sometimes, because I spend a great deal of time in Houston, I'll read the Houston Chronicle, and when I read their articles about Houston, it reminds me of when I was a columnist with the LA Times, where the paper's like the occupying army. I mean, these people really, they're never going to own a home there. They're never going to raise their family there. They're really living in a different reality. And then, of course, the fact is, one of the unfortunate things of the decline of the newspaper industry, which I spent much of my life in, is that there are now fewer and fewer jobs at local papers for people who are rooted in their community. So we now have even more concentration of media in fewer and fewer places. And then the other part, if you work in this crazy business, is it pays so badly that a lot of the people in it have inherited money, because anybody who actually has to pay the rent is in big trouble.
So did you always have these feelings about high-density development, or did some cities' evolution to the high density we see today actually change your views about cities?
Well, the book started off as a lecture for the Lee Kuan Yew Institute in Singapore, which is probably the best run dense urban place in the world. You could question their authoritarian practices sometimes, but I have never been in a place that runs so well. You get there at 4 o'clock in the morning and you don't feel like going to sleep. You walk anywhere and nobody's going to touch you. It's completely safe, very clean. You could eat off the street. The problem is, even in the most perfect urban environment that's probably ever been constructed, I did hundreds of interviews with young Singaporeans, because the government brought me in and say, why aren't our people having kids? They even have reasonably good housing policies. The housing is much cheaper than it is in Hong Kong. And I remember one woman in particular, I asked her, I said, well, we had this debate, well, it wasn't a debate, I was asked, how much money would it take for you to have a kid? How much money would the government of Singapore have to pay you? And I kept saying, well, 100,000, 200,000. When I got to $1 million, I said, okay, I don't think I'm authorized to go that high. And I said, well, why do you feel that way? She says, okay, think about this. A young woman, master's degree, gets into the job market at 30. gets a little apartment, maybe gets married, maybe not. And she says, look, if I had a child and my boss says I've got to go to Vietnam for 3 weeks, you know what? I can't compete with a woman who doesn't have a child. And so what we're doing is we're creating, one of the great ironies of our society is we have a society desperate for human capital, but we're actually snuffing out the future human capital because those people living in places like Singapore, like Manhattan, like Paris, like certainly West Los Angeles, definitely San Francisco, really are faced with the choice of do I have a family or do I live in the city? And I don't think that should be the choice.
Or you could have a dog.
Well,
I mean, one of the things you point out in here is San Francisco now has 80,000 more dogs than children.
Well, and here's another thing that I just researched. There are now more households in America with dogs than households with children. And that we just did the research on that.
But I mean, the facts in here are fascinating. I mean, you do point out that Manhattan, Seattle, San Francisco, Boston have the lowest percentage of children of cities in the country. And then the really ultra-dense cities in the world, like Hong Kong, Singapore, Seoul, have actually the lowest fertility rates on Earth.
And the lowest fertility rate, my colleague Gavin Jones from Singapore came up with this. The lowest the lowest fertility rate ever recorded is now in Shanghai, where it's about 0.8. The replacement is 2.1. And outside of great plagues or wars, we've never seen that low a fertility rate. And you look at Shanghai, it's dense, crowded, competitive, one of the great cities of the world, but people don't have children there.
So the other thing in here that's very interesting is you very graphically chronicle what I might call sort of the intellectual scorn, derision, and condescension about suburbs. I mean, the International Congress of Modern Architecture described suburbs as a kind of scum churning against the walls of the city. There's someone who is actually quoted in here as talking about where people are fatter, slower, and dumber. And someone else refers to it as Vulgaria. And then you go on to say there is an unjust war against suburbs by intellectuals, environmentalists, developers, planners, and central city enthusiasts. To talk to us about that war, and then also in a way that explains, why it really isn't unjust. Aren't there arguments that suburbs are in fact bad for the climate, segregated, inefficient for housing, inefficient for jobs, lack artistic opportunities, closed-minded? You're the champion.
Well, I'm really a champion of people having a choice. And I'm also a champion of maybe this is the way I grew up. My mother grew up in a place called Brownsville, Brooklyn, if you're familiar with it. As she would say, I won't use her exact language in this public place, but it was a crummy neighborhood then, and it's a crummy neighborhood now. And she would say they lived in a crowded apartment, 5 kids. When my mother moved to Long Island, it was like ascending to heaven. One of the greatest social advances in history was the movement of people out of the very dense cities of the early 20th century into the suburbs. And it happened in many countries, including Japan. Now, the question of whether these suburbs are as bad as people suggest. First of all, on the diversity issue, minorities are moving to the suburbs as fast as they can. I mean, that's absolutely the fact. Particularly true of both Hispanics and of Asians. Of the 20 municipalities with the highest Asian population, 18 of them are suburbs. So when somebody moves to Dallas, they don't move to downtown Dallas. If they're coming from it, most Asians, they're going to go to Plano. They're going to go to Richardson. Same thing in Houston. If you go to Sugar Land, that's where the gigantic Hindu temple is. Same thing in the UK. If you ever saw Bend It Like Beckham, it takes place in this sort of outer northern suburbs of London. When I was doing interviews for a previous project in London, and I wanted to interview Indian community leaders, I usually ended up spending about 45 minutes on the train getting from the center out there. So the diversity issue is kind of absurd at this stage of the game. The second issue is the environment. All different sorts of ways that we can do this. Do suburbs need to change? Obviously they need to change, just like cities need to change. But we forget of something called the urban heat island, where if you have a lot of concrete and very little green space, it tends to make things a lot hotter. I mean, if you've ever been in Manhattan in August, I wouldn't wish it on too many people, but if you go to Manhattan in August, and then you go out to Brooklyn, it's a little bit better, and you get out to Long Island, it's a lot better. I mean, why do you think all these people are in the Hamptons? So I think that we have to understand that there are ways that suburbs can develop. Now, one thing where suburbs are very good is for solar power, because they have roofs, and planting trees. And I saw a wonderful presentation. There's a great book coming out from MIT, which I co-edited, on the future of suburbia, and there's a presentation about how the grass absorbs the heat. So it's not necessarily sure that all the idea that, well, if we pack people in together, it'll be better for the environment. That's probably not necessarily true. So there's a lot that we could do to improve the suburbs. I'm not arguing that we want to recreate Levittown. Levittown was great for the time it was there. It was a liberation for people who had been living on top of each other for years and years. They finally got away from your mother-in-law. I mean, you know, there were all sorts of wonderful things about it. I mean, literally, that's in the accounts. But we can build suburbs that are very, very environmentally friendly. We have an enormous opportunity. I think the greatest opportunity in terms of the environment is having people work at home. If you're going to work at home, you're going to need a little bit of space. You're probably not, if you look at where people who work at home tend to be, they tend to work in suburbs. There's many ways that we can make things better. And obviously electric cars and more fuel-efficient cars would be a good thing too.
So you've exploded the myths about suburbs being worse for the climate, being worse for segregation. What about for innovation? You know, there are people who, you know, write in your field about the creative class.
Right.
And is it obvious that suburbs are worse for that? I mean, couldn't you call Silicon Valley a suburbs?
Silicon Valley is a suburb. By the way, they don't have garages in San Francisco. I mean, there's something, I mean, there are great advantages to urban life for certain kinds of industries. A lot of what we call tech now is really business service and media. And media, there is some real advantages. But if you look at where most of the tech workers are in this country, they're in places like Silicon Valley. They're in North Dallas. They're in one of the fastest growing tech communities in the country is in Phoenix.
West of central Houston or the Boston suburbs.
And it all depends on the kind of technology. But if you're developing, let's say if you're developing new cars, they're probably better off in the suburbs. And the other thing is generational. The millennials are a very big generation. When they are now, by 2018, they'll be more over 30 than under 30. At all the historical trends and the trends we have now show that when people get into their 30s, they start looking for different environments. Some of them are going to look for smaller towns in the countryside, but a lot of them are going to be looking for the suburbs for the very reason they want to raise a family.
I was really surprised actually by your statistics about millennials, because they're, you know, the urbanists you're attacking make snide comments like, you know, millennials aren't going to want to go back to the cul-de-sacs of their teenage years. Yet, in fact, you find 43% of millennials describe suburbs as the ideal place to live versus only 17% saying that of urban cores. Why is there such a disconnect between what millennials say they want and what the other urbanists say they want?
Some of it is the issue of class. I spoke at a business group down in Florida earlier this year, and very nice fellow president of a Fortune 100 company said, well, I thought all the kids were going to Brooklyn and San Francisco. I said, no, it's your kids who are in Brooklyn and San Francisco. To give you an illustration, since 2000, there's all this talk about downtown LA. Okay, 5,000 millennials, more millennials now than there were then. The increase in the millennial population of the western end of the Inland Empire, San Bernardino, Riverside, was 130,000. So we call them, you know, sort of the phantom millennials. Like they don't really exist because, you know, they don't go to a coffee shop and have a goatee, or, They don't fit the image of what the media perceives. And I think that that's really one of the things that I find astounding is I work with a very, very good demographer, and basically somebody says, well, this is what's happening. I said, I wonder what the census has to say. Like the secretary of HUD gets up and said, people are not moving the suburbs, they're all moving back to the central city. Why don't you walk over to the Commerce Department and find out the numbers before you say something? If any of you ran your business the way pundits make their statements, you'd all be out of business.
Let's talk a little bit about the connection between urbanization and inequality. I mean, we at the Ideas Festival, many of our sessions this summer, we're talking about, really sort of the issue of our time, right. Growing gap between the wealthy and everybody else, the decline of the middle class, and really the development of class in this country in a way that hasn't existed before. Let me just read one paragraph from this book. Probably many of the people in this room, I guess, when they're not in Aspen, are in Manhattan. Manhattan, the densest and most influential urban environment in North America, exhibits the most profound level of inequality and bifurcated class structure in the United States. Even in nouveau hipster and increasingly expensive Brooklyn, nearly a quarter of residents, mainly African American and Latino, are below the poverty line, while the wealthy generally shop at artisanal cheese shops and frequent trendy restaurants. 1 in 4 Brooklynites receives food stamps. In fact, New York has experienced the biggest rise in its number of homeless in the nation, and its number of children sleeping in shelters has risen steadily, even as its elite economy has boomed.
And I think you can make the same statement of most cities. Los Angeles, we see the same thing. Incredible poverty, high degrees of people living 4, 5, 6 to a house. About in overall in LA County, largest county in the United States, about 39% of the people can barely pay their bills. People are paying 40, 50% of their income in rent. So what's happened increasingly is that the cities are functioning very well for the upper classes and for the young, upwardly mobile, very well educated, most of whom will probably not stay there, but a lot, some of them will. But they're really very, very tough places for people who are working in the service industries, but still have to pay the high rents and the high costs of being in a place like New York. And that's, by the way, part of the reasons why you have a very strong migration of both Latinos and African Americans, A, to the south, and B, to the suburbs. We did a study for the Center for Opportunity Urbanism, and one of the great ironies of the 15 best metropolitan regions in America for African Americans in terms of how they performed economically and other factors, started businesses, of the 15, 13 were in the old Confederacy. It's sort of ironic.
So Mayor Bloomberg famously said that a successful city must be a luxury product, and once said that if we can find a bunch of billionaires around the world to move here, that would be a godsend. What's your response?
Well, I think it's a godsend for them, and it's a godsend probably for the coffers of the city. There's probably some advantages, although a lot of those people are people who are living in New York not long enough to pay New York taxes. So I think that one of the things that I think happens is you create a kind of city that works for some people, not for others. What's tragic in my mind, being myself, as you could probably tell from my accent, a native New Yorker, is that the New York I grew up in, the middle class New York, the ethnic New York that I grew up in, my grandmother would walk me on through Manhattan, and she'd say, this is a Ukrainian neighborhood and this was an Irish neighborhood, and that mosaic of New York City, particularly of Manhattan, is almost it's become a gigantic yuppie haven surrounded with pockets of poverty. But that middle class New York is slowly, and San Francisco, I lived in the Bay Area too, San Francisco's also lost that.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the older New York. Jane Jacobs, who was a great advocate of cities and even said cities are better places to raise families, had in mind Greenwich Village of 50 years ago. But there aren't too many families being raised in Greenwich Village today.
No, I think it's their rate of children is about a third the national average. You know, Jane Jacobs had this idea of this Manhattan, Greenwich Village, where there were big extended families, where an Italian family, 3 of them would live in the same apartment building, so there was always somebody to watch the kids. Or she talks about the guy who owned the candy store who would chastise her kids if they did something wrong. You know, the person working in the candy, well, first of all, it probably isn't the candy store, but the person working in the Walgreens or whatever, where kids get candy, you know, he wouldn't know these kids, you know, if they came from the moon. I mean, so it's, you know, that kind of intimacy is gone. And that's one of the funny things about suburbia. You know, people always write about suburbia as if, oh, the alienated, nobody knows anyone. I can tell you that the survey research will show that suburbanites are more satisfied with their lives than people living in cities. It's pretty consistent. But the other thing is that they socialize more with their neighbors. You know, and maybe there's something about the good fences make good neighbors. But I find even in our own neighborhood, we've moved to Orange County, you know, we have neighbors that we can count on. You know, they fight over who's going to watch our youngest daughter if we can't find a babysitter. I mean, there's something going on, you know, the involvement in churches. I know that it's not very fashionable, but those churches or the synagogues or the mosques, those are really flourishing the most in the suburbs. So there's a lot of social capital there that's really important.
Now, you talk about lots of different kinds of cities, and we've talked already this evening a little bit about, you know, the New Yorks and the San Franciscos and the Chicagos and Bostons on the one side, but you also write about the Houstons and the San Diegos, very different, and then also the Buffalos and the Clevelands and the Toledos. Can you just take us on a quick tour of how you would categorize different American cities?
Well, there are what you would call the luxury cities. Wharton has called them superstar cities, which are like the New Yorks and Chicagos, which are increasingly bifurcated, places where young people, particularly well-educated, affluent young people go. That's one kind of city, and a lot of immigrants still go. Then there's what I would call the opportunity cities, and these are places that offer all those things. I mean, I can tell you in inner parts of Houston, inner parts of Dallas, there's all sorts of exciting stuff going on. There's more multifamily being built in those cities than are being built in the Bay Area or Los Angeles. But I think those cities are flexible enough that you have options. And one of the things that I find really attractive, particularly about the Texas cities, whether they're Austin, San Antonio, Houston, Dallas, and the same thing could be said of a lot of these other cities, you know, like the Phoenixes, is you can live that hip, cool, inner life, but when you decide that you want something else, you can stay in the same place. And these are places where, when you look at what's happening with millennial migration, this is where they're going. Number one increase in millennial migration is Nashville, Tennessee. That's where they want to go. Now, the last group of cities, the Buffalos, the Clevelands, that's a harder case. But it's interesting to me that Cleveland now has net positive millennial migration with New York, which you would never think. Because people begin to say, I just can't afford to live that way. There was a beautiful piece written in New Geography, the website that I run, where a guy from San Francisco did about a young, very well-educated woman who moves to Cincinnati. And in Cincinnati, she has exactly what she would have loved to have had in San Francisco, but couldn't. So there is some hope that people are going to begin to resettle some of these Rust Belt cities, because, you know, some of them have great bones. They have some great architecture, some of them have terrific cultural institutions, and you can live in a beautiful suburb of Cleveland and be downtown in 15 minutes.
I'm just going to ask a few more questions and then open it up to the audience too. You know, as an urban historian, and you write fascinatingly about cities in different eras, just wonder if you could live in any city in any era, what would it be?
Okay, that's a good one. Well, my background, I had 7 years of Latin. My mother always said, well, you want to be the first Jewish pope? And they said, well, the first pope was Jewish. But I would say, I don't know if Rome would have been too much. I think some of the more provincial cities, like what became Marseille, that was where a lot of young Romans went. You know, south of France is, you know, outside of Southern California, the most glorious climate in the world. I think that some of those Roman provincial cities would have been really great places to live. Rome was incredibly fascinating, but probably absolutely impossible unless you were really wealthy. There were all sorts of problems. More recently, in the 17th century, I think Amsterdam is my ideal of a city. Pretty dense, but 3-4 stories, but incredibly open, great place where people came from all over the world. It was Descartes said that Amsterdam was the inventory of the possible. People could go there. I mean, one of the things that Jane Jacobs talks about, the function of a great city is to take people who start here and raise them up. That's why I always loved New York, because it did it for my family. So that's a really important thing. The more recent case, I think the most exciting city I've ever been in was Hong Kong when under the British. Perfect combination. Chinese food, Chinese entrepreneurial energy, and British law. That's exactly what you want. And it was a tremendous melting pot. I remember interviewing one Indian guy. He said, this is a place where the Pakistanis and the Indians like each other because they both like curry.
We've talked mainly about American cities, so you've talked about some other cities. There's a lot in the book about megacities all over the world. And the World Bank also champions density as a key to prosperity. But you talk about something you called megapolitan elephantiasis.
Well, that's actually Mumford's quote.
Oh, is that Mumford?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about, and even one can almost see some of the urbanists you're critiquing almost seeing virtue in slums in some cases.
Oh, yes.
But just take us to Mumbai, Karachi, Mexico City, Jakarta, and tell us what you see and what scares you there.
Well, I can tell the two that I've spent time in. One is Mumbai, and it's an exciting city, but the quality of life is awful. I don't know why we think that people should want to pack themselves into these places. Besides the fact that it's terrible traffic and all that. I remember talking to the head of the environmental network there, and he said when he was a kid, he could hear various wild animals, and there were all sorts of birds. That said now it's basically crows and rats. That's all you've got left. Talk about ecological disaster. If you go to a place like Dharavi, the largest slum in India, you just say, how is this possibly good? Maybe because I have a mother who grew up in the slums. I can't fathom how intelligent, supposedly caring people think that this is a great way of life. Mexico City, a city that my book, the City of Global History, starts in. Great city, very exciting, but also awful communities that are very, very difficult. And the middle class is also very stressed out. I think that we have to think about, and I think Prime Minister Modi in India has thought about some of this, about not putting more and more people into these megacities, but seeing how you could make the villages work and the smaller cities work where the cost of living will be less, where people can have a little more space. I just find it inhuman that we would want to promote, Mumbai is, let's say, 20 million people. Mumbai at 30 million people, pretty close to hell on earth, I would say. So I think we really have to start rethinking in the developing countries where we want people to live, what kind of environment we want, and I find it just opportunistic by companies and by some pundits to say, oh well, people should live in these terrible communities because it's better for the planet or it's a better way of life. It really isn't a better way of life. For some people it is, but for most it isn't.
Again, another thing we've been talking a lot about in various contexts here at Aspen is the increasing political divide that we see in Europe and the United States, not necessarily right, left, but urban cosmopolitan versus whatever the opposite of that is. And that was reflected in the Brexit vote.
Definitely. With
the core of London voting overwhelmingly to remain and the countryside voting overwhelmingly the other way. And even people are, see similar kinds of divides in the United States with where Mr. Trump is getting his support, and as opposed to in the urban cores. You want to just talk a little bit about that and whether it overlaps with some of your themes?
Well, some of it does. I mean, I was one of the few people who thought Brexit could win, and it did, because the people that I was relying on for data were basically monitoring what was happening in working class England. And what's clear is that in the Brexit vote, the outer suburbs of London, particularly the working class ones, some of the last white working class districts inside London, and around the countryside, all the suburbs around the bigger cities, even though the city cores tended to vote against it, there was a pretty clear pattern. The countryside, a little bit less of a factor there. In the United States, it is a great tragedy of this country that we should be having debates about these issues, and unfortunately, the Republicans decided to nominate somebody who's so abhorrent, and by the way, lives in a tower in Manhattan and couldn't be any more elitist. Everything that I think anybody who's in the suburbs thinks that Donald Trump is going to help them is just missing out, because Donald Trump has never been interested in the suburbs. His father was interested in middle class people and the suburbs. I don't think Donald Trump would give them a moment's thought. But the resentment of this cosmopolitan urban elite is strong, and for many people, they respond to the siren song of Donald Trump, I think, not really recognizing who he is and what he represents.
One last urban geography question, and then we'll go to the audience, and that is, the banlieue in Paris,
yes,
and the enormous frustration, anger, segregation, disassociation. How does that connect to some of your themes?
Oh, well, this is a pattern that we see to some extent in this country. If you see what's happening, let's say, take Houston, which is a good place to study because it's like fruit flies, it's like big chromosomes. The inside 610 has actually really become very urban, sort of hip, great food, lots of cultural activities. And then you have the outer areas, which are where most of the growth is, and they're doing great. But in between is sort of, in the Houston context, between 610 and 8. But you see that in almost every American city, and even more so in Europe, old suburbs that have now begun to deteriorate, where the housing, let's say in Southern California, was built in the 1940s and 50s, and they're not wonderful craftsman houses. They're, 2-bedroom, 1-bath houses that you can't really sell very well on the market. Everywhere in this country, there are these, some of them are suburbs, some of them are inside the city. You go to South Los Angeles, it's not that dense. It's just a lot of old houses, and they've, of course, also been hurt by the deindustrialization of the country, because that's where a lot of the industry had been. So this pattern that you see in France, you see in many other parts of the world, where one of the things I'm hoping that our think tank will get into is how can we improve cities without having to have gentrification? Why can't we improve cities so that the working class population, the African American population, the Latino population can be part of the urban renaissance instead of being pushed out by it?
Okay, with that answer, let me turn to the audience. And again, because we tape this and it's on our website and it's also live, we have to wait for a microphone. So if you could raise your hand. I may actually rely on the mic carriers. I think there's a question right here in the second row on this side. And for others, people waiting, just point out. Okay, good, thank you. Just your name and question, please.
My name is Mary Torres. I'm from a suburb right outside Chicago. And one thing that
Can you tell which one? I was just there.
Oak Park.
Oak Park, oh, sure.
All right. The one thing that I think hasn't been addressed enough is that the quality of the school systems within the city is going to be a determining factor in how well the children of these, whether they're immigrants or from African American families, actually succeed in the future. And the other thing that is not mentioned on the mainstream media is the terrible crime rate in Chicago, and that is deliberately suppressed
Yes,
for a very long time.
you couldn't be more on target. I was on a panel in Washington with the mayor of Atlanta, and he said, well, we're doing this, we're doing that. And I said, why don't you fix the schools? Why don't you do something about the crime rate? You want to know why middle-class people, no matter what their race, move to the suburbs? It's the biggest reason. Many people, my own family, we lived in Brooklyn. My father didn't want to leave Brooklyn, but the high school that we would have gone to was so dangerous that my cousins who stayed in that neighborhood could not go to the bathroom in their high school all the way through, okay? So this is a huge factor. The crime in Chicago, the rise of crime in many of American cities, this drives people out. So, even like I can say in my own case, I have my one girl in Arizona, but my youngest is still going to grade school. And we moved from Los Angeles to Orange County, and I would say a big part of the reason is public schools. I didn't want to keep sending my daughter to private school. It was, first of all, I felt they paid enough in taxes, I should get something for it. That was one factor. Also, I like the fact that she goes to a school that's 40% Latino, 15% Asian. She meets all different kinds of kids, and it's still a good school, and it's still safe. So you couldn't be more on target. I mean, people move out largely for schools. This is true in almost every American city, Dallas, Houston, Chicago. I was just in Lake County, Illinois. I gave a speech there a couple weeks ago. And that's what's driving their growth. And you know what? I was amazed. I was in Lake County and I saw 4 Korean barbecue places all within about 4 blocks. Because people are saying, hey, you know what? I want my kid to have a good education. Now, when my parents were growing up, you could get a really good education in most of New York City. You could still do it. It's become harder and harder and harder. So you couldn't be more on target. That those are key factors. I discuss them some in the book, and we've looked at the migration. One of the reasons why people move out of Manhattan at age 5 is education.
Over here, please.
Projecting a macro view of the near future, what changes do you see in the physical demographics based on the transportation changes that are going to take place, as well as the job
What's
world?
going to happen with demographics?
Well, what changes do you see within the demographics that then will influence what changes may take place in the cities and the suburbs and things of that type?
Well, I think there's one big factor is going to be people who want to have children are going to move to those places where they can afford to have them. So if you take a look at for instance, where the demographic growth is taking place, it's not just suburbia per se, it's suburbia in affordable regions of the country. So you're going to see much more growth taking place. Just finishing a big project on Texas cities, and they all have fairly young populations. So that's going to be one factor. A second factor, and I think it's going to be a very scary thing if we continue on the path we are now, which I hope we're not. If we continue with 1-2% economic growth, and that growth being essentially asset inflation, I can see enormous increases in class problems, in the crime problems, in the education problems. When I talk to teachers, sometimes I'll say something and they'll come to me and they say, you shouldn't blame us because I'm educating kids whose parents never go to school meetings, never meet with me, don't even know if their kids are going to school or not. That's a real problem. I mean, my book before this was about the class conflict, and so I'm glad that Elliot brought it up. This is really a huge problem for this country because we've, as a country, are really based on the idea of upward mobility and having a big middle class, and we're moving away from that. And if we move away from that, we're going to have some very, very dangerous situations where we're going to have a lot of young people. I mean, even riding my bike in Orange County, and I go, let's say, 10, 15 minutes from my house, and there are there are barrios, and there are kids hanging out on the street corners, even more so when I lived in Los Angeles for 40 years. What happens to them? They dropped out of high school, or they graduated, they had socially promoted, but they have no skills, no discipline. I think that's a very scary future. And I think that what's so awful to me is we have no political strategy to address these demographic problems. And for those of us who are getting a little older, maybe a lot older, the real thing that I think is going to be a problem is what happens when all the boomers are in their 80s and there aren't enough young, productive workers to pay for everything. That's already beginning to happen in Japan. Give you an idea where Japan is on demographics and where we might be heading. By 2050, Japan will have more people over 80 than under 15. Now, you tell me how that works. Now, there are people in Silicon Valley who say, oh, no problem, we'll have robots, and robots will do everything. Well, I don't know what kind of society Silicon Valley has in mind for us, but I'm glad that I probably won't get to see it.
Yes, in the middle here, gentlemen.
Hi, my name is Stephen Wicks. I've spent many years mourning the decline of small, independently owned retailers. Am I onto something, or should I get over it and just get used to the big box stores?
I think that there are two contrary trends. Those businesses, independent businesses that have nothing unique about them, I mean, the classic cases would be the hardware stores or the clothing stores that sell at 30% higher, the stuff that Target sells. I mean, I can tell you, I didn't know Target existed until I had kids. You know, because you don't want to buy expensive clothes that somebody's going to grow out of them in a year. So I think that there are going to be certain niches, but what's a promising thing is that I think people do want something unique and interesting, and we certainly see that in restaurants. I've already seen it here in Aspen. I see it in Orange County. I think that there are some contrary trends, but there's certainly a danger of these independent businesses, particularly for smaller towns, suburbs, because those are the people who really care. I mean, you know, when we were talking about the candy store owner in New York, you know, my great-grandparents had a candy store in East New York. That person was rooted in that community. They cared about that community. They cared that the streets were taken care of. The person who works for the chain business, they're in that store for 1 year, and 2 years later they're someplace else. So, you know, I think that we have to figure out some ways to make it easier for the independent business. And I think there's a huge hunger, and not just among the yuppies and hipsters and those people, for something genuine. You know, even if it's a hamburger place that's a real hamburger place, or, you know, not just a chain. And I think it's important for the fabric of our communities that we find ways of maintaining them in the future, because I think these are very important citizens, particularly if you take a small town that doesn't have a big corporation and there aren't a lot of large businesses. Those small businesses are the ones who really care about what's happening in that community.
Thanks, Stephen. Good to have you back. Over here, and then we'll come down to the second row.
Hi, my name's George Faulk. Just a quick comment. 65 years ago, East New York was still very livable. And you probably went to Highland Park on your days off. But anyway, my question is, because of the digital access that so many people have, and especially the young working generation, can you address the situation with the smaller cities, 34,000 to 100,000, 150,000, because they're very livable, they have downtowns and renewed downtowns. New England, for instance, Northampton, a good example. Smaller cities around Hartford, Connecticut. I'd be interested in a comment on that.
Well, this is also one of the great ways that we can address the class issue and the upward mobility issue, is if people can find alternative places to go. I've done a lot of work in North Dakota. Fargo is a very livable city, except for the weather. But remember, I live in Southern California, so I'm a bit of a wuss on that issue. But the fact is, these are nice places, and they're not isolated. I remember years ago when I was reporting for the New York Times out in Weston, Iowa, you were really limited. You know, if you wanted a Wall Street Journal, it was a 3-day-old dog-eared copy. There were 2 television stations. I've now been in towns of 6,000 in North Dakota where I talk to a wheat farmer, and he knows what the weather is in Perth, Australia, because he's figuring out, well, how much is the price of wheat going to go up? He has the same information as a commodity broker in Chicago. What we're also seeing is the beginnings of movement of some of the tech industry to particularly the attractive suburban areas and the attractive small towns. People should see what's going on in Des Moines, what's going on in Ames. A lot of those communities, Dickinson, North Dakota, Bismarck, North Dakota, these places are becoming very liberal. And the positive thing about the internet, there's some very negative things, but the positive thing is that sense of isolation is broken. You know, Karl Marx wrote about the idiocy of rural life. Well, the idiocy of rural life was because the rural community was cut off from all the information. Now, I'm sure those of you who maybe even while you're here in Aspen and maybe you live here are doing business on a national and international scale. The internet lets you do that in Aspen. The first time I ran into this is Park City, Utah, probably the best situated place for this because you're 45 minutes to the Salt Lake Airport, which goes pretty much everywhere. These are very attractive places, and I think we ought to think about, as Modi is thinking about in India in a different context, that we should look at the heartland of America, the smaller communities, as a great resource so that we don't have to have a situation where a young family can never buy a house. I remember years ago I did some interviews at Washington University with postdocs, you know, the creme de la creme of what any city wants. And I said, well, how come you're not living in San Diego or Boston? He said, because I would never be able to buy a house. That's why I live in St. Louis. And I think we're going to see that eventually push out to some of these nicer small communities. Many of them are going to die. Many of them are going to become less and less populated. But some of them are going to do really well. And I think they're a resource. You know, Franklin Roosevelt did a very great thing with the Agricultural Extension Service, bringing lots of things to these small towns, or the Carnegie Libraries. I think we have to start thinking about the small town America as something that we can build on, not something that we want to reject and look down on, and is only good because we want to have a vacation in an uncrowded place.
Last question, gentlemen, right here in front.
Hi. It seems like a lot of the issues that you mentioned of being problems with urban areas tend to flow from a fundamental supply and demand issue of there not being enough urban areas. So wouldn't that be an argument for trying to expand those, you know, densify those mid-level suburbs into a more dense urban fabric? Because otherwise, how do you address this issue of, you know, farmland and habitat loss at the edges
first
of the cities?
We lose more farmland to the retirement of farmland by far than we lose to urbanization or suburbanization. You know, New England now has more trees than it had for 200 years. We have as much forest cover or more forest cover than we had in the 1850s. So that is kind of a, you know, it's an emotional issue. And you feel it, you know, if you live in a place like California where the difference from 40 years ago is pretty dramatic, you can sense this. But here's my point. I think you could have some more density in suburban areas. But if you densify them too much, then what's the point? Why would I live there? I mean, I can tell you, I lived in the San Fernando Valley for 15 years. In many ways, I like it very much. As the city of LA decided that they were not going to fix the roads, and they spent $16 billion on transit so that we now have fewer people on transit than we did in 1990. But what we found is that once you are a suburban community, people go there for a certain reason. If you densify it and the traffic gets bad, well, what's the point of being there? I mean, you have to understand why people move to suburbs and why they move to smaller towns. If they wanted to be in the city, they'd want to be there. It's like one of the person was saying to me, well, Asians will really like density because they grew up in it. And I said, if they liked it, they would have stayed home. I mean, when you talk to the great inspiration for me is immigrants, even my mother-in-law who's from Paris, and you realize how nice it is for them to have a backyard. How nice it is that there's an owl in the backyard, or we have a lot of birds, and it's a great pleasure. I think we have to allow for cities to densify as much as they want. A lot of great urban neighborhoods don't want to densify. There are whole sections of New York City. Jane Jacobs wrote about it. Yorkville, as a kid, I used to go there because my father spoke German, and there was really great German restaurants, and it was really a neat neighborhood. Then they built a lot of high-rises, and she writes about this. It lost all its character. It became just another dormitory for Goldman Sachs. And so I think that even in urban areas, San Francisco, there's a huge pushback because even in an urban setting, it's a big difference between 3-story buildings and 10-story buildings. And the last point on affordability, we did some research on this. To build a high-rise building in the Bay Area is 5 times more expensive per square foot than a single-family house or a townhouse. So it doesn't address the affordability problem either. We have to become, if you will, more liberal in the classic sense of let people, as much as possible, choose what they want, not to say, you have to live this way. And lastly, I can't resist it. I don't want to be told by people who live in palaces that I should live in a hovel, or that my Mexican neighbor shouldn't be able to live in a nice neighborhood in Orange County because he's eating up too many resources. And yet, I don't want to hear that from people who live much better and have bigger carbon footprints than I could even imagine ever having.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joel Kotkin, thank you very much.